this problem, how do you manage your computations? How do you decide what to think about and what not to think about, and when to think about it and when to act? How does the brain do that? Offers a really nice insights into all these sort of weird phenomena like habits, compulsion, and people say racism and stuff. Is a different way of thinking about these really deep problems.
We're going to look back on this and kind of be embarrassed.
I think there's sort of has. I'm embarrassed now.
I am too. Yeah.
We don't know anything. It's so hopeless. Like, it's just so complicated. It's such a mess. This reminds me of this joke that Daniel Wolpert used to start his talks with.
This is Brain Inspired.
When should we think, and when should we act? And when it's appropriate to think, what should we think about? That is the crux of what we talk about today, part of what Nathaniel Daw is working on these days. Hello, everyone. This is Paul Middlebrooks from Bend, Oregon today, on a little trip with my family. It's lovely here. I've already gone on a few runs along the Deschutes River Trail. I highly recommend it. All right. Nathaniel Daw is a professor at the Princeton Neuroscience Institute, and man, he has done some stuff. His main focus is building computational models to account for how our brains learn and make decisions. And as you'll hear, he's also interested in tying in these models to neuropsychiatric disorders. So he's done a lot of work using reinforcement learning as a starting point, but that's really underselling the breadth and depth of his work, both past and present. And I encourage you to visit his lab website to enter the rabbit hole, which you will then go down. Today, we talk about things like the difference between model-based and model-free reinforcement learning, and how the brain controls which of these to use in different situations. We review the phenomenon of replay in brains and machines, and in brains, this is where sequences of brain activity are replayed in neural circuits at different times and in different ways relative to when an experience actually occurs. We talk about some of his most recent work on how replay in the hippocampus could help us figure out which memories are appropriate to conjure up and prioritize in given circumstances to make appropriate decisions, and how this potential role of replay can explain many different flavors of replay that have been observed over the years. As usual, we perambulate many other topics, including his upcoming keynote address at the Cognitive Computational Neuroscience Conference. I'll be speaking to a few more of the keynote speakers for CCN. This is a conference you will want to attend in the years moving forward. It's in Berlin this year, Germany, and I think it'll be somewhere in the USA next year. Find the show notes at braininspired.co/podcast/37. I'm so grateful to all of my guests, Nathaniel included, of course, who take the time out of their very busy schedules to share their science and stories with little old me. So I hope that you guys are grateful to them as well. And of course, I am grateful to you for listening. So thanks. All right, I've got to take my kids to an old volcano now, and hopefully for my sake and theirs, it is not too active. Enjoy Nathaniel Daw. Welcome, Nathaniel. Thanks for joining me on the show.
I'm happy to be here.
So I got stood up last night by your wife.
No kidding.
Yael Niv. I was actually supposed to interview her just last night, and as these things happen, it didn't work out because of internet connection and scheduling and things like that. I also did not know that you were married to Yael Niv, and there's a complete coincidence that I would have been interviewing you guys back to back. I guess I'm not up on my celebrity neuroscience couples.
There are a lot of them, actually. How do you meet people in neuroscience, right?
Well, I'm going to start off with a really hard-hitting question here. How do you make a marriage between two neuroscientists in very overlapping fields? How do you make that work out? I know that you're in the throngs of childcare right now while she travels, for instance.
Yeah, but I think there's a sense in which it works very well that we can help each other out and have all the same constraints and professional challenges and so on. And so I think, academic marriages work well. There's sometimes we have to go to the same conference, and that often poses a childcare issue.
Yeah.
And I think if I had like ordered a wife out of a catalog, I probably wouldn't end up have chosen one that does exactly the same thing I do. But life is what it is.
Life is what it is.
She's fantastic. So, as you'll no doubt find out if you ever get the chance to actually talk to her.
Well, geez, that's what I keep hearing. She's every time I tell someone, I'm going to be interviewing Gael pretty soon. Everyone's so excited about it. No one was that excited about you, Nathaniel, but I'm going to interview you anyway.
Fair enough. Well, I'm the substitute, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, you're going to be giving a keynote address at the Cognitive Computational Neuroscience Conference in a few months. And that conference is all about bringing together neuroscience, cognitive science, and artificial intelligence. I'm wondering if you have a take on how these fields, which are overlapping, but have their own communities and stuff, how they can best work together.
Yeah, that's something I've thought about a lot because I did my PhD in computer science, and I, had a lot of professional advantages and a lot of professional challenges, I think, related to that.
Related to, what do you mean?
Well, to being being a computer science, knowing computer science in neuroscience and psychology has been just an incredible secret weapon.
Yeah.
Really. Made a whole, career off it, right?
Would you say that you're had the right knowledge base at the right time, or is this a recurring theme, you think, in neuroscience? Because the computer science backgrounds really seems to be flourishing right now.
Yeah, I think there's just so many opportunities there, and partly maybe and there have been for a while, and I think there will continue to be, and partly this reflects, of course, my own weird perspective and bias,
right.
But I just think computer science, neuroscience, especially in psychology, just have such a need for theory, really, right? For some kind of high level understanding. And there's just computer scientists know so much about how to think about problems, how to formalize them, what are the sort of families of ways you can approach them, in so many different areas. And neuroscientists basically, no offense to all of us, know nothing about these things, right? There's just so much, the parts of neuroscience that have been the most successful, like vision, are the parts where we forget that there's all this sort of engineering knowledge, right, or signal detection theory and stuff that underpins the study of it. And the parts that don't have that is just so challenging, right? And so I just think there's so much opportunity for sort of knowledge transfer from computer science to neuroscience and psychology. Not just, there's also sort of big data there's data analysis kinds of things as well, but I'm talking more about sort of conceptual kind of theory, level ideas. I've never been it's not clear to me there's as much opportunity in the other direction, that AI needs neuroscience or psychology. I know lots of people are excited about that. The opportunities I've seen have mostly gone the other way. So I'm more of a consumer in a sense of computer science than a producer.
Do you think that, so there's this kind of conflicting trend that we become more and more specialized as time goes on in a science, right? Because the body of knowledge grows so large. And it used to be that there are Renaissance people, I'll say, not Renaissance men, where you sort of learned, if you went back 2,000 years, it wouldn't take much to, we know more about so many things than people did 2,000 years ago. Mathematics, for instance, right?
Right.
Even just in our lower level mathematical training. Do you envision that people becoming more like Renaissance people and learning these broader fields, or is it going to continue to get narrower and narrower, where we're going to have to cross communicate at conferences like CCN, for instance?
Well, yeah, no, I do. I think that is indeed why there are opportunities, right? Because people X and people Y work in different, traditions and have different core knowledge. There's always opportunities at the interface, right? And particularly if you have very well chosen ones, like I think CCN does, it can be very profitable to bring together people from different perspectives, even within neuroscience, right? I mean, I've spent a lot of time talking to people who work on memory, like Daphne Shohami and Deborah Talmy and so on, and that's been very productive. And it takes a lot of work, right? Like it's not like there's like a lot of low hanging fruit where you just get together and write a paper. Like it takes a lot of thinking to draw these connections, but there are lots of opportunities, right? Precisely, I think, for the reason you say.
But so you don't think like a future neuroscientist student, for instance, will need to incorporate all these bodies of knowledge? I mean, will they be shooting themselves in the foot by being so limited in their scope, for instance, right?
I think you're right that the world that, things get very specialized. I do think, of course, I think everybody should know computer science and math and stuff, right? But, and I try to teach that to our students and propagate it in our curriculum and stuff. But there is a limit to what you can cram in someone's head. And so we do have to work in teams, and I do think that will become increasingly important. Now, do you know this reminds me of this joke that Daniel Wolpert used to start his talks with, where he would plot the number of pages of Kandel and Schwartz by edition, right, or by year, right, and he would show that it was growing exponentially, right, and he would extrapolate this forward to when his daughter was going to be in grad school or something, and it was going to be a 50,000 page book, and his idea is that like the sort of punchline of that joke was that the job of experimentalists is to like make that book longer, or sort of to collect more stamps and fill it up with more facts, and the job of theorists is to sort of bend the curve there and shorten it and derive understanding, and shorten the book basically. And the argument is that theorists are losing. But maybe, if we succeeded, maybe that's right. Maybe if we really understood things, you really could be someone who understands all this stuff. And,
So this reminds me of like Society for Neuroscience, right? As a point of comparison, that conference has become so large. And just to compare it to something like the CCN, and there are a bunch of these, right? Like Cosine, for instance, right? That have become like these smaller specialized conferences where you can still get stuff done. So in the textbook analogy, these would be like, specialized shorter textbooks, right? But is there something special about these smaller type conferences with respect to something like Society for Neuroscience? And is it even worth going to Society for Neuroscience anymore? In the same respect, is it worth reading Kandel and Schwartz, right? The big neuroscience book.
I would probably read the Kandel and Schwartz before I went to SFN, honestly. But I love these smaller conferences. And I'm not sure I think the right way to think about them is like hyper specialized. I mean, it is, I think Cosine kind of grew out of the neuroscience part of NIPS, sort of splitting off and then blossoming into its own little subfield,
right,
and community. And then I think CCN in some ways has split off from that, right?
So things like VSS, like a vision-specific conference. So there are lots of these offshoots that are smaller, that are more tenable, and almost coming from a theoretical perspective, right? So these are like the theorists almost winning their smaller battles in the war or something.
Yeah, and I think that CCN and also Cosine and RLDM, which is one that I'm involved with as well, reinforcement decision making, and Yale's also involved in. This interdisciplinary character they have makes them a little different from the international conference of people who study the cell in the kidney or something, right? Like it really is about kind of opening up our perspectives. Well, neuroeconomics is another, right? They're explicitly kind of interdisciplinary and intercultural, and I think that's very productive. And there is a sort of size that makes that work, and it's they can't be everything. And I think CCN can't be Cosine and vice versa, but I think they both work.
Are you going to be talking about replay at CCN? Do you know like possibly what you might be? I know it's a few months away, but what you might be talking about?
I haven't completely decided. I might talk about replay. The other thing, so either I'm going to talk about replay or I'm going to talk about sort of population coding and the dopamine system.
Oh, cool.
So that's the other sort of new computational project I'm sort of playing with.
So when you go to like something like CCN, right? Are you looking to take away new experimental information if you're coming from the theory side, or what's something that generally that you might come away from a conference like that with?
So I think for me, again, the thing that makes CCN special or neuroeconomics special or RLDM special is the chance to sort of hear a different field. How is, Yoshua Bengio thinking about things, or
Mm-hmm.
How is Rich Sutton thinking about things? I think that's, I spend all day reading papers in my, in the sort of part of neuroscience that I work in.
Right.
And so it's really refreshing to have this sort of different set of talks and interactions and posters and conversations. And I think that's what's really special about it. And so for me, I think it's especially the computer science, but also there are sort of parts of the human computational cognitive science kind of world, like memory or people who study perception or something that aren't sort of the people I see at the really little meetings I go to with my friends all the time, right?
When you come across some field like that hasn't been touched by a sort of more theoretical framework, do you just think, oh my God, what's wrong with this field, or what?
or there's an opportunity, right? Like,
Sure,
I tend to think
those aren't mutually exclusive.
Right. Yeah. No. But so I'm going to psychiatry for instance, for a bunch of reasons, and a bunch of us in kind of my subfield have, and there's a level at which the actual psychiatrists will say, they have no theory and it's a complete shambles. They don't know. They have no laboratory tests. Right. It's the only part of medicine where the only thing that gives you a diagnosis is, a bunch of self-reported symptoms. Like they can't send you for blood tests to test whether you really have what they think you have.
Right.
And so it's at some level a catastrophe, right? And a lot of opportunity. And yet I'm not the kind of I also kind of assume that those guys are smart people and girls, and the women, that those people are smart scientists and doctors, and they know what they're doing, and they have a lot of knowledge, right? And I think there's often opportunities in sort of trying to distill that and sort of connect that up with more computational ways of thinking.
Yeah.
My whole PhD or my postdoctoral work was this sort of my whole model-based Model 3 thing was really about listening to these behavioral psychologists who study habits and deliberation, goal-directed behavior. And they have this they're theorists in a sense, like they have these sort of word theories of how the associative structures that make these things work. And so very clever experiments and just a beautiful set of experiments and knowledge going back to Tolman and before.
Yeah.
And sort of figuring that out, right? Really taking that on board and reading it and understanding it, and then trying to kind of give it more of a computational flavor or gloss has been sort of, something I'm working on forever, right? It's lots of opportunities.
When you do give a talk, how does it feel these days relative to how it felt when you were just starting out? Were you ever nervous? You don't seem like a nervous speaker, or
I am. I get this. You see, I'm drinking water. Actually, I get this dry mouth.
Oh yeah.
Definitely have these. I'm actually a very nervous person, and I definitely have physical nervous symptoms. But I also, I guess, it's the habits thing, right? Like certainly now, I give talks and I sort of just zone out, and it all sort of comes out of me without me thinking about it too much anymore. That's different than it used to be when I was a kid.
What's one of the, people have talk about their scientific moments, right? Where they realize, they discover something, they realize something. Do you have one of those moments, like when you've been attending a conference that has really shifted your focus or enlightened you, or something that you remember being at a conference like that?
I'm not sure I have these kind of aha moments in general, like...
Not in scientific endeavors either?
Yeah. It's like the difference, like it takes a while for things to sort of sink in, right? Like often I have like I fight with someone about something and it takes me a few days to realize that like actually there's something to it, and like, that changes my thinking. But it never happens to me in the moment, right? And so the same at conferences.
Wait, are we talking about marriage or science here?
I didn't say. It's like, let's say a student. But
it's more of an incubation sort of thing, huh?
Yeah, exactly. Or like, ideas have to sort of, definitely incubate or sort of work their way. I feel like a lot of it, especially what I do, the kind of theory that I most value is sort of trying to really understand things. It's not so much like specific results or even specific ideas. It's sort of how to think about things and how it all fits together and what's the sort of the core issue. I feel like that often takes a lot of time to refine, and writing a paper and rewriting a paper and giving talks about it. I'm still sort of, refining the way I talk about the stuff I did 15 years ago. And so similarly with conferences, there's lots of ideas I get exposed to, and those are influential to me. Absolutely. But it's hard for me to sort of crisply say, this is the moment that that I had this aha moment.
Yeah, it doesn't even have to be an aha moment. I remember going when I was looking for postdocs, and you don't have to answer, because you might not have a moment, but it just reminds me of, I walked up to, I was looking for postdocs, so I did some research on people that I might want to talk to, and I walked up to this guy's poster. He was a PI, and the PI was there. He was actually presenting his poster, and he had never heard of me, and I asked him, do you have like openings for your postdocs? For a postdoc position, and his eyes kind of like widened, and he was like, "Why are you talking to me? This is like the wrong way to do this." I don't know what he was thinking, but
Rich Sutton taught me how to tie my shoes at NIPS once. That's
like the fancy tying.
Like I was just like tying my shoes. Like I was hanging around with him at NIPS, and he noticed, to his credit, that my shoes came untied like every 5 minutes. And he finally was like, you're tying your shoes wrong, Nathaniel. Like, let me show you. And I was like, what? Leave me alone. Like, and then sure enough, I was doing something wrong, and he fixed it for me. So,
oh my God, now I want to know what you were doing wrong with your shoes.
This kind of thing, like, left over right, right over left. Like, I didn't realize you have to do that when you tie your shoes also. Like, it turns out it matters. Like, you might not know either, but
the order?
Rich taught me that if you do it the wrong, like when you make a slip knot, if you just, turns out it matters.
Are you left-handed?
No.
Huh. So there you go, folks. The moment, the conference moment from Nathaniel.
There it is.
So Nathaniel, I had Tim Behrens on the show, and we talked about a little bit about replay, because he works a little bit on that, a lot on that actually. And I told him that you're going to be on, and he said, "Oh, good. Why don't you expose that guy for who he really is?" And so this is what we're going to try to do. Okay. So
I see.
So let's talk replay and reinforcement learning and some of your recent work here. Just very broadly, because we've talked about reinforcement learning on the show before, but in reinforcement learning, the goal is to maximize future expected rewards in an uncertain environment, essentially. And you've done a lot of work on how and when we use what's called model-based reinforcement learning versus model-free reinforcement learning. Now, I had a friend in graduate school, he's a colleague, friend, and he self-admittedly had a problem with sweets, like he couldn't not eat sweets if they were in front of him. He would visit this cupcake shop, which is within walking distance of our lab. And he told me a story one day, like he visited the shop and he was looking at the cupcakes, and one of the employees started taking the cupcakes out of the display, and he asked, what are you doing with why are you taking the cupcakes out? And the way he tells the story, the employee slipped up, quote unquote, and told him, "Oh, we have to throw these away at the end of the day because we can only keep them for one day." Kind of a fancier cupcake place. And so the light went off in my friend's head, and that evening he went and looked through all of the dumpsters behind the cupcake shop, looking for the bag, opening bags, looking for the cupcakes. My question is that a problem with his model-free reinforcement learning?
Or is it a deeper problem? Yeah, so this is a good example, actually, of why the sort of simple goals and habits dichotomy isn't good enough. So the version of this I often think about or often refer to is drugs, right? Mm-hmm. So there's this story. So the background of these stories, right, is that there's supposed to be, historically there's been this sort of two-system idea that you have a deliberative system that knows what's good for you and makes good choices and thinks a lot about the value of things, and there's an automatic system that can make mistakes and do things that are sort of contextually inappropriate, or for whatever reason there's sort of habits that you repeat a lot, but you repeat them again when you shouldn't, and so on. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons people are excited about this idea, there's many reasons people are excited about this idea. All of them have to do with the fact that this seems like a way of thinking about why we might be of two minds of things, whether it's racism or moral dilemmas or drug abuse, right? Compulsion. And so the compulsion story is that, drugs affect dopamine, and dopamine trains up these habits. And so you have people who have these sort of almost automatic behaviors that are wrong and that they know are wrong. And it's this kind of imbalance between this automatic system that's been maladaptively trained.
And this falls under the rubric of model-free reinforcement learning.
Yeah,
right?
so that's the habits are the sort of model-free. That's the sort of classic story of dopamine, training up sort of automatic stimulus response kind of behaviors, right? But that seems, that seems very appealing, but it sort of can't really be the story. And I think your story about digging around for cupcakes is an example of that, right? That might explain like the habitual movement of, a cigarette to your lips or something over and over again.
Right.
But it can't really explain like really motivated, drug-seeking, very novel behaviors that people do to obtain drugs.
Got to make this phone call to talk to this guy to get to this place.
Yeah, things you've never done before, right? So habits are sort of well-practiced actions, and that might be part of drug abuse, but it doesn't explain if it's really the case that I know that heroin is terrible for me and I shouldn't use it. Why am I engaging in all this planning to obtain it? And there's got to be some kind of crosstalk. So why am I digging around in garbage bags for cupcakes I shouldn't eat anyway? And that's kind of disgusting, right? That can't be a habit, right? So my favorite example of this actually is the Wire, right? So you have these guys, Johnny and Bubbles, the comic relief
television show.
Yeah, The Wire is the best television show ever made.
I tried to watch. Okay.
Yeah, it's hard to understand. But if you can sort of get past the dialect and understand what's going on, but there are these junkies that are on it. As sort of the comic relief is not quite there's a sort of pathos to them, sort of clowns. And it's like every week they have to engage in like some new weird crime to obtain drugs. Like they rob an ambulance, or they like fish with a fishing pole off a building to grab drugs from them. And that was fiction, but I think it rings true, and it's something that a habit story can't possibly explain, right? There's sort of a pure model free, I've very well practiced this particular sequence of actions, and so my body now does it automatically, or it's locked in by dopamine having trained up maladaptive actions. That can't be right.
So then that's a more deliberative style of choosing actions and behavior. How do these like model-based and model-free reinforcement learning constructs, how do they map onto our brains? I know you don't care about brains, but
did I say I don't care about brains?
No, you computational, computer scientists, you're all the same. But what's like the very broad stroke picture of how what we've understood in the past of how they map onto different areas of the brain?
Yeah. So the story of habits, right? There's this classic story going back to the 90s and Wolfram Schultz's dopamine recordings, Peter Dayan, Reed Montague theory about this, this neuromodulator dopamine, which is released in these ascending projections from the midbrain and sort of wash kind of most of the interesting parts of the rest of the brain in this neuromodulated dopamine, which is involved in movement and reward and so on, drugs of abuse. And it's supposed to carry this prediction error signal, which is exactly the prediction error signal you would need, difference between expected and observed rewards and so on, for training up sort of, I took this action and it worked, so I'll take it next time. So learning these habits, right? So sort of experiential learning, procedural learning of habits. This is called model-free reinforcement learning in the reinforcement learning in AI. Another approach to this problem, known as model-based reinforcement learning, is more about mental simulation, right? So I learn in the spatial case a map of the world. I learn where the restaurants are, and you put me down somewhere, and I can sort of spin out paths in my head to try to figure out how to get to the restaurant, or try to figure out what the best path I could take is or something. And importantly, this kind of learning can figure out new things that I've never done before, like, robbing an ambulance to get drugs or something, right? The characteristic or digging through garbage bags for cupcakes. It's able to, extrapolate from knowledge about how the world works and sort of mental simulations to derive sort of new decisions, goal-directed, creative, flexible decisions, right? And there's various evidence that even rats can do this as well, and people can. Less is known about how it works in the brain. Probably the most suggestive thing is this evidence about hippocampus, right? So there's a bunch of reasons to think that hippocampus is broadly involved in this kind of computation or decision making or inference, whatever you want to call it. And one of them is that in the case of spatial tasks, as you know, hippocampus is famous for having these place cells that show you that if you listen to them, seem to represent where the animal thinks he is, right? Mm-hmm. So you have a rat, and these neurons are tuned for locations. When the animal runs through that location, they blitz cells, they blitz spikes. And less famously, but more excitingly, they also sometimes respond to locations where the animal isn't. For instance, when the animal is sort of standing still at a choice point, it seems like they spin out trajectories in front of the animal or behind the animal after a reward and so on. And so there had been an idea that you're actually seeing this kind of mental simulation here, that this is the animal thinking about routes he could take and evaluating whether they're good ones or trying to figure out where he can get or how to get somewhere, right? So that might be, and that's an idea we've been pursuing lately, how the brain, or one of the ways the brain achieves this kind of flexible, kind of goal-directed planning by mental simulation, model-based reinforcement learning, as we call it.
Let's take a quick break here. Giannis, Mike, Bram, David, and Daniel, my real heart may go glub glub phew, but you guys make my heart go pitter patter. Thank you for supporting the show through Patreon. You too, listener, can support the show for as little as $2 per month. Head to braininspired.co and find the red button there. If you value the show, your contribution will definitely help improve it moving forward. A lot of your previous work has been figuring out from a theoretical basis how the brain decides when to use model-based versus how the brain decides when to use model-free. And this work that you're talking about, that we're going to talk about in just a minute here with replay, I mean, you have become unsatisfied with an account of these two processes occurring completely separately. And instead, you think it makes a lot more sense to use both processes sort of together and to go back and forth. So the story of each of them being used separately no longer seems to satisfy you, right? Which has sort of led into this work with replay, which brings us to what I know of what you're doing modern day. I know you're beyond that now because of the way science works. But you just talked a little bit about what replay is and what we know about it in animals from a theoretical perspective. So that's from like the neuroscience side. So replay in artificial intelligence has sort of famously been used, well, I don't know how famous it is, in deep Q networks. So the deep Q networks that learned the Atari games, to play the Atari games so well. And in that case, the word replay meant simply like refeeding previous training examples into the deep network. And those training examples were drawn randomly, from the previous examples, and you just refeed them in. And that was done to help remove these correlations that could occur naturally, like in the sequences and the structure of the games that were being played, because those correlations in the sequences might actually slow the learning of the network. So you'd want to like feed these unstructured, uncorrelated training examples in. And more recently, there's been some work on figuring out how to prioritize which previous training examples are the right ones to feed in, right? So that you can speed up learning. And it was shown that this speeds up learning in the deep network. It's frustrating to me, actually, as a side note, that we continue in AI and in neuroscience to use the same terms for different things, because that's different than what replay is from what we understand of the human brain. But anyway, you've recently developed a theoretical framework to account for how brains might figure out which memories should be used in a given situation when figuring out how to make a decision to maximize future rewards. So it's a form of meta decision making, essentially. And this was published way back in 2018 in Nature Neuroscience, called Prioritized Memory Access Explains Planning and Hippocampal Replay. And it integrates and accounts for a host of seemingly disparate facts about replay, some of which you were just describing a few minutes ago. Maybe you can just start by talking about how it brings together what's known, what we know about replay, some of those facts.
Sure. So there are an awful lot of there've been an awful lot of experiments that have revealed that in different circumstances, these hippocampal neurons engage in this thing called replay, right? That they represent locations and trajectories often, or at least pairs of cells or something, other than where the animal is. So sometimes when he's asleep or quietly resting, other times during behavior, there are these sharp wave events that where a series of hippocampal neurons light up very rapidly, and they often form a coherent trajectory, often starting where the animal is and heading somewhere else in front of or behind him.
Is this the same as like sharp wave ripples?
This is sharp. So sharp wave ripples is what's happening in the EEG during that. And if you look at the neurons, as I understand it, there's this sort of coherent population activity.
I see.
Where a series of place cells light up.
So sharp wave ripples. Sorry, just to interrupt. Like sharp wave ripples is like maybe the clearest oscillation, strongest oscillation that's known in the brain, and it happens in hippocampus. People are familiar with gamma oscillations and different theta, beta waves, et cetera, that are measured in EEG. But sharp wave ripples, which correspond to what Nathaniel's talking about, these sequences of neurons that light up, apparently, are just another oscillation that occurs. But it's sort of
a brief packet, right?
It's unlike a brief packet, yeah.
Theta, right? So theta is another rhythm, EEG rhythm that you see in hippocampus when animals are running. So sharp waves mostly happen when the animal's standing still. When animals running, you see this 8 hertz oscillation in the EEG. That's also associated with this is sort of confusing, and I actually get in trouble with this in talks for confusing these things or deliberately mixing them up. But it's also the case that during theta, there's this phenomenon known as phase precession, where the location represented by the neuron seems to sort of oscillate back and forth a bit in front of the animal, but closer than sharp wave ripples, I think, go farther. So there's a second EEG event and a second type of non-local activity, but we're mostly talking about these sharp wave ripples.
Sorry to interrupt.
That maybe was
Tim mentioned that last time, and I just let it slide, so I just wanted to interject. So
yeah. So sorry. So then the question is, what do these things do? And there are these exciting results from say Pfeiffer and Foster that say that they run ahead of the animal. And, like the animal's foraging for food and there's a goal and you see them sort of tracing out the location of the goal and the animal runs there.
Right.
And so that really sounds like this sort of planning thing that we're excited about. And yet the first time I said this, I think it was to Lauren Frank, who's another hippocampal physiologist. He said that that's hogwash because the neurons they fire behind the animal as much as they fire in front of the animal, maybe even more. So it's clearly not really about forward planning, right? So, and in fact, Foster himself became famous for discovering backwards replay before he was working on forward replay, which is when the animal gets to the end of the maze, he eats the food, and then the place cells light up from where he came from or where he could have come from, right? So the whole sequence rewinds backwards behind the animal, and you really know it's backwards because the place cells are directed. So it's like the animal is running backwards in his place cells. You actually know it's not playing out running forward the other way. It's playing out running backwards behind him, rewinding.
Yeah.
So there's just a bunch of these different phenomena, and they happen they're all non-local trajectories. There's other ones that happen in sleep, and I think there tended to be a sense that partly because they're sort of triggered at different times, they have different functions. As far as this is not my world, but if you read the literature on this, I think people argue that maybe forward replay really is about planning and backward replay is about credit assignment or learning or something, and replay when you're asleep is about consolidation. And maybe that actually is more related to the thing you mentioned about, making gradients, sort of batching up gradients in deep networks and system consolidation or something. It's certainly possible. But the hope that we had was maybe we could view all of these as sort of special cases of the same operation. And that operation is the operation. If I think about how do I get from here to there, another way of saying that is that in the world, sort of maybe the primary problem of reinforcement learning or of decision making is that my actions are separated from their consequences in space and time. And that makes it hard to figure out what to do. But it also makes it hard to sort of learn about how my actions are related to their consequences just, in the brain. Like, how do I connect, running here in the maze to get to the end where there's the food, right? Those two things happen separately. And so I think the core idea, one way to think about what replay is doing is it's bringing those two things together, right? Is sort of lighting up sequences of, in this spatial case, locations that you could occupy sequentially so that you can sort of connect the thing at one end to the thing at the other end. And if you think it that way, it doesn't necessarily have to be thinking ahead about what I could do. Like, I can think about, hey, I want to get a hamburger, where can I go find a hamburger? But I could also find a hamburger and be like, hey, here's a hamburger. How could I have gotten here? Tomorrow, can I come here from my office, right, and get another hamburger, and think backwards, right? And actually sort of serves the same purpose. It's just happening in the other direction. And when I'm asleep, I could dream about all the different ways of getting hamburgers. It's almost dinner time here, you see.
Yeah.
And
it's breakfast time here, but it still sounds good.
Yeah. And so that's sort of, that's the sort of unifying explanation that we sort of offered. And then that's the functional idea. The functional idea is that it's connecting actions to their valuable consequences over these spatial trajectories, right? And in reinforcement learning, that's called backups, right? You have to compute the formal operation, and reinforcement learning is about computing the long-term value of an action, the so-called state action value function, and the Q function. It's something about, I'm going to take some action. I want to know what's its long-term sum of expected cumulative future discounted rewards, right? And if I knew that, then it reduces the problem of choosing what to do to just comparing a bunch of numbers for different actions, right, that represent the long run value. And you compute those by these backups, right? Like, it's
called a Bellman backup, is what the version that
yeah. The Bellman's equation, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like adding up rewards over a trajectory, or a tree of future possible trajectories or something. Okay, so that's the operation we suggest that replay could be doing in all of these cases, right? And then sort of what remains is trying to develop a theory of, why is it that you see this pattern at this circumstance and that pattern at that circumstance, and a sort of a bunch of seemingly paradoxical results, or at least disparate results about different circumstances producing different patterns of replay. And the story there is this prioritization story, right? So we say, let's assume that this is what replay is for. Let's try to develop at least a sort of toy model that gives us intuitions and sort of formal sort of quantitative theorems about which location should I be thinking about when. And that turns out to have reasonably interpretable components. So part of it relates to, you want to think about places you're going to be. It's not worth my doing a bunch of work computing stuff about situations I'm never going to face, right? So there's no point in my planning my Nobel Prize speech or something, right?
Well, so just to back up, so you brought all this under essentially one equation, which is the expected value of backup, and I think what you're about to start talking about is the needs versus gains.
That's right.
So So just to give the equation, like the equation is essentially this expected value of backup equals needs. Is it dot product or times?
It's gains.
Times gains.
Yeah.
So you're just going into talking about the needs part of that equation, I think. So go ahead and talk about needs and gains for us then.
Yeah. So just to why is it called the expected value of backup? So we wanted to produce a rational model of these backup operations. Like, what place in the world should I be thinking about if I'm a rat at any particular time? Let's treat that like all other decision theory, reinforcement learning type problems as itself an expected value problem, maximization problem. I want to choose the one that's will earn me the most rewards. How will earn me the most rewards? If I think about some place and that helps me make better choices in the future, that'll earn me more rewards. Like, literally let me vacuum up more food. That's a value of computation, right? Like a literal value of computation. We want to measure that or approximate that at least.
Mm-hmm.
That's an expected value. It has a form like many expected values, like a probability times a magnitude. So we call the probability need, right? That's how likely am I going to be in this location, basically. If I'm not going to be there, all the thinking I do about what to do there isn't going to help me. And conversely, if I am going to be somewhere, then it's worth my thinking about what to do there. That's multiplied for each location by the second term we call gain, which is like how much would I earn by figuring out what to do at this location by doing some computation here, right? And how much more food will this help me vacuum up? So it's a balance between these two things, which together quantify for different places in the world what's the value of thinking about them. And particularly thinking about the actions I can choose there, the value of the actions I can choose there, so as to make better choices and earn more food. And one aspect of this is because it's the balance between these two factors, because need is about imminence. It basically wants to drive thinking in front of you. It's like, I'm about to turn left or right. I really should think about what's left of me and what's right of me. That's where the need is. That's where I'm likely to be soon in the future. Gain is about where do I know stuff that would be helpful for me to learn about. So gain is about where are there rewards in the world that I haven't sort of sufficiently connected to everything else. So I find this hamburger. I should think about all the different ways I can exploit this, right? And so that actually drives replay behind me, not necessarily where I came from, but to places I could have come from.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's the sort of interplay between those two things and the extent to which they play out in there's a magnitude in different locations and different circumstances that we try to connect to all these patterns of replay in the literature.
So how does this relate to the model-based versus model-free concepts? Is that too broad of a question?
No, it's it's sort of the key question in some ways. So it is a sort of one level down from the sort of model-based versus model-free. So you mentioned that we were sort of dissatisfied. I should say, by the way, this work is with Marcela Matar, who's the sort of lead author on all this that we're talking about. So the conception in which we picked up, but certainly predates us, of model-based versus model-free and goals versus habits and deliberation versus automaticity and so on, is this sort of two-system trade-off. It's like I can either think or act. And the question is, when should I think and when should I act? And I think considerations much like the expected value of backup help you think about when does the brain decide it's worth its time to deliberate, and when does it think it knows what's best and should just go ahead and act faster. So there's a sort of time cost deliberation and that trades off against the chance of figuring out something better. So this is sort of very similar idea, but applied to the sort of discrete trade-off. So I think that basic logic makes a lot of sense, right? I really do think, I continue to think that's a deep insight, that the brain has to manage its computations. It's got to sort of selectively spend its time and its resources split between acting and computing. And when it computes, it's got to figure out what to compute about. And so I think of this story about replay as being kind of a more fine-grained theory, not just of whether to think or not, but what to think about, right? And the special case of that is not to think at all, right? And to act, that's sort of the habits case. But I think a lot of the action, which we had sort of missed before, it's not really, except in the sort of very small toy problems that we actually use in the laboratory, you can't think about everything, right? Like in the real world, the brain has to be choosy about which computations it's going to do. So I think as much of the action is, in the case of spatial tasks, which paths do I think about and which paths do I neglect, as much as do I think at all, right? And so this is meant to be a theory of that, right?
Yeah, so in terms of brain energy, like just spending metabolic energy in our brains, right? It seems like the more meta we get, so it seems like it's worthwhile to spend a lot more time figuring out what we need to think about than actually thinking about it and acting on it, right? Do you think that it's more that we spend more brain energy thinking about or deliberating about what we need to think about, figuring out the environment and what's actually useful, what's not useful, versus actually working on the problem, getting to the food or something like that? Does that make sense?
Well, I don't know. So first of all, I actually don't, I've never really gotten a clear understanding about the sort of metabolic cost of all this.
Let's say computational resources then.
Yeah, well, but so that's a lot. So this is a question like, what is the cost, right? The cost might just be time, right? If I really have to stand still and think, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe a slightly more refined version of that is I have a certain number of working memory slots or something, or I can only think about one trajectory at a time or something.
What if we're going to how about quantifying the information it takes to figure out what to think about versus the information it takes to solve the problem?
I see. Maybe I think I misunderstood. So one question is just when do we act and when do we think, right? But there's maybe an additional question, which is the sort of turtles on turtles question. How do I figure out where to think about? And it's absolutely true, if this is what you're getting at, unless I've misunderstood you, that the theories we've described of how to direct your thinking are totally unrealistic. That, DeepMind is not running to implement these and speed up their computation, right? Because the way we do it is we literally move to every location in the maze and we compute like what would be the expected value backup here, right? So that would spend a huge amount of energy, as it were, thinking about what to do before even thinking about what to think about, let alone thinking about it and then acting. And so this is not meant as a realistic process or mechanism level theory of this sort of meta control problem of directing the replay. It's meant to sort of shed light on the principles that should govern this. And then we separately have to think of it as a realistic way that the brain can do this.
Yeah.
But it's certainly, you're absolutely right. There's sort of a diminishing return. If you think too hard in the service of figuring out what to think about, you're wasting your time, right? Was that where you were getting at?
A little bit. Let me try to rephrase this. I'm not asking well either, but I'm definitely on the right track, and I'm kind of circling in here. But so we don't experience all of the unconscious processing that's going on, right? So when I'm gonna go to the hamburger place, right? I'm not thinking like that there are all these different possibilities. My experience of it is I just go to the hamburger place, right? But then there are what your theory is suggesting is that there are all these processes taking place unconsciously that seem to be the majority of our cognition, I guess is another way of putting it, right? And then it suggests a minority of our cognition is actually implementing some action or behavior. It's like 99% of what we do, of course, is under the hood and we're not aware of, right? It just seems like a lot of resources being spent on these meta processes that eventually get funneled into a behavior. We can move on if I'm not making sense either.
No, but I mean, I'm trying to think if I agree with you. Well, it's certainly true that lots of stuff is going on that we're not conscious of. I certainly agree with that. To my mind, one of the insights of all this work, or one of the key questions of all this work, is that the brain has to make smart choices about spending its computational resources, whatever exactly those are. Right? That has to be. You just can't get by. And I think these examples of these, DeepMind things doing random replay, in banks of power plants and, wherever it is that Google is, are, churning out electricity to make this happen.
I think it's the Dallas in Oregon, maybe? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean the brain has to be selective, right? It doesn't have the electricity to think about everything, right? And you can't do that in real time. And so what we've sort of argued is that this problem, how do you manage your computations? How do you decide what to think about and what not to think about, and when to think about it and when to act? How does the brain do that? Offers a really nice insights into all these sort of weird phenomena like habits, compulsion, and people say racism and stuff. Is a different way of thinking about these really deep problems. And so I think there's something to that. But I think that the thing that you're identifying is also that there has to be, and we don't have a really clear mechanistic story of how the brain actually does this, right? In a way that we make it sound like, I think it is super important, right? But I think the brain must have efficient ways to do it that only approximate the principles that we've tried to, by sort of very laborious kind of ideal observer analysis, tried to lay out, right? But that can't be how it works. And your kind of intuition that my brain would spend all this time thinking about what to think about can't be right? I mean, is a valid criticism, but there must be some way of squaring the circle.
Well, it's not even a criticism. It's just amazing that our experience of ourselves, that our intuition is so wrong. I think that I'm thinking about the problem, but mostly I'm thinking about how to think about the problem without even knowing I'm thinking about how to think about the problem, right?
But maybe you have really smart, reflexes that direct your thinking. So there's a sort of sub discussion within my little tiny sub-discipline of people who think about this problem. There's a set of people who think this is all itself learned, right?
Huh.
So I'm going to learn by trial and error how to learn by trial and error or something.
Yes.
And I think that's crazy, right? I think there's no way, it's hard enough to learn, let alone the trial and error learning of how to do that is going to happen an order of magnitude slower, right? It's just, whereas what I've got to figure out what to do on day one when you put me in a new puzzle. So I think there's got to be really smart, sort of pre-tuned reflexes for this, if you call them that.
At some point, there has to be that constraint.
Yeah, no, I think that's right.
So we've been talking about this, and the examples you've been giving are spatial and sort of harken back to rodents in a maze task, often, trying to find food and stuff. But I talked to Tim Behrens, a few episodes ago, and he's done a lot of work on using these same principles in an abstract knowledge cognitive map sense, right? That we can not only spatially navigate mazes, but conceptually navigate abstract concepts. I'm wondering if this expected value of backup concept can map on to the conceptual space as well as the spatial domain.
I think the short answer is yes. So of course there's a long answer, but yes. The nice thing about these kind of reinforcement learning decision theoretic formalisms is they just work in state spaces, right? And figuring out what the state space is of course a whole separate issue and one you'll probably talk to Yael about. But the theories really just talk about states and actions. And it could be an Atari game, it can be a maze, it can be all kinds of things, and it's a very general theory. And I think there is lots of evidence, that the hippocampus and related areas like frontal cortex are involved, like Tim says, in more than just space. And it probably is, relations between states or events or stuff in the world, and understanding that relational structure, much like a map of space, you can have a sort of map of the rules of a game or something, right? Mm-hmm. One of the reasons we're so excited about thinking about it in terms of space is just that is a case, maybe the only case, where we have really clear technology and knowledge about how the brain represents it, that you can actually look inside the animal's brain and see what routes he's thinking about, right? And so if we're right that this is the whole game, is why do they think about which routes win and what makes that happen? Spatial tasks are really the most exciting place to look for that. But presumably the same thing is true playing chess. We just don't have, chess location cells that we can look at necessarily. There's other things. Space is a little bit special structurally. So it's, for instance, it's reversible. I can go forward or backwards. It's deterministic. Like if I go north from here, I always end up in the same place. And so there are aspects of the problem that are different, a little bit different, I think, in other domains where those things aren't true. And those might involve other neural substrates, and those might involve somewhat different computational. So our computational story was specialized for this particular case of a deterministic world, for instance, just to make it simpler. I think we could write it down for a probabilistic world that's more complicated.
Getting back to this idea of sort of meta decisions, which is just kind of in the realm of what you do here. So it's like decisions like figuring out under what circumstances to act in a certain way. How many meta levels are there, do you think, of computation? Got to choose a number, man. You got to choose a number.
Yeah. One. I don't. There's actually there's this paper. There's a set of imaging papers that sort of I think is it from David Batter or something, where you can actually make animals or people do more and more deeply nested decision problems or something, and you see that the activation moves forward like half an inch each time or something. So you have to measure when they run out of prefrontal cortex, right?
That's the guy that I walked up to his poster about the postdoc question, by the way.
Okay, David Vedder?
Yeah.
That's hilarious.
He was very nice.
I love the guy. Yeah, no, he's fantastic. But I always thought that, I wanted to like literally test that, extrapolate the depth of problems I could solve, and then try it on orangutan or something who has less frontal polar cortex or something. But sorry, the serious question, I don't think it's like literally a hierarchy, right? I think there's a useful distinction between physical decisions about where to move your muscles and, how to locomote in the world and stuff. And we've, for a long time, realized that it's good to think about that in terms of sort of decision theory and reinforcement learning and sort of rational sort of choice models, drawing on economists also. I think the insight is just that there are all these internal decisions the brain has to make about how to manage its resources and control itself, and that we can think about those the same way, like with the same, at least theoretical machinery. I don't know that they live in like a set of A, meta A, meta meta A.
Right.
But I think the real thing that people have realized is some of the same theory, and maybe also some of the same like physical kind of
machinery
mechanisms in the brain might serve both of those purposes, right?
So you don't think that it's like a trend of evolution to just starting from like the with the highest level or whatever. Some people think consciousness is a model of our cognition, right? And so and what you're doing is kind of like a model of our decision making. So then it might make sense to have a model of that model, and eventually it becomes unknown to us what advantages we would gain by modeling a model of a model of a model. But it also seems to be a trend in evolution that a model of itself seems to be useful. I mean, you can see this in DNA as well, obviously, right?
Right.
I mean, do you think that that's a trend in increasing complexity or solving problems?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I mean, another way of spinning that, maybe changing it, but evolution is really good at copying stuff, right?
Right.
And reusing stuff.
With
and
low
so
fidelity.
Yeah, or I mean, it's easy to grow a third arm or something, right? Like, relatively speaking, I think, but or maybe a third and a fourth, I don't know. But so I think there is this sort of principle of reuse where you might have evolved something that's for controlling your limbs, and then it's relatively easy to repurpose that to use it on controlling itself, controlling the controller or something, or controlling some other set of decisions that are being made internally. And so I do think that probably is partly because of how evolution works, but maybe also, as you say, partly because that's useful for solving problems. Maybe that is a principle.
Wes.
Yeah?
Mind if I ask you a question?
Yes?
Hard question?
No.
Do you think the podcast is boring?
Yeah.
Why do you think it's boring?
Because, you're only, talking.
What do you think would make it more entertaining, better?
Songs and, songs.
Like piano songs and stuff?
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
You're welcome. Welcome.
So we were talking about, the cost sort of computationally or information-wise of these sorts of things, and how energy inefficient something like, AI systems are that Google uses or something. Okay, and humans have this sort of lower level rote reinforcement learning, model-free reinforcement learning system, right? But if you're an AI and your job is to, do some problems, would you ever want to even use a model-free reinforcement learning system, or wouldn't you just want to spend the extra amount of energy on a model-based system to make sure you got it right?
Well, but it's not just so. I think that's a great question. I think that sort of goes to the heart of the problem. But I think it's the same. If I'm a lunar lander or something, this thing that drives around the moon, or a self-driving car, the trade-off is the same, right? You don't have infinite time. And I think the core point is that if I'm a self-driving car, I can stand still and burn out my battery, deciding whether to turn left or right, and that's going to have diminishing returns,
Sure.
right? I mean, to some extent, I should do that. If I have to decide not to run somebody over or something, but to some extent, I should go ahead and act, right? And I think that really is. I think that there are people who work on, these kind of vehicles and are interested in these questions of how do I trade off thinking and acting, and how do I efficiently allocate what computational resources I have.
But presumably, an electronic system, or even if we have come up with better neuromorphic computing that uses much less energy, relative to our own energy use, an AI would essentially have infinite capacity, or at least so much more than we do. So the trade-off might not be as necessary as my question. It's actually a question.
Well, think about a chess computer, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think that's a good example. And chess computers, even in, I think, 2019 with AlphaGo 18 or whatever it is, the whole game, there are more chess positions than there are atoms in the universe or something, right? Yeah. And so the whole game is about, which paths do I follow? Which ones are important? And that's the same problem, right? It's about efficiently allocating my computation. And that goes back to the beginning of AI, and it continues to this day. And that a lot of the action in AlphaGo is that problem coming up in different ways, right? It's which paths should I think about, and when I think about them, which paths are likely to happen afterwards, and that's a huge problem. So of course the quantitative trade-off can differ, but I do think it's sort of core to the problem in AI as well. I sort of wonder if this is a case, this particular example is something, we were talking at the very beginning about whether psychology and neuroscience have anything to offer AI. I sort of wonder if this is something, this is a problem I've worked on, but so I may be biased, if this is something where neuroscience and psychology might have something to offer, in the sense that I think these ideas of sort of, my sense is that computer science does a lot of work on analyzing the behavior of algorithms and when is this sorting algorithm better than that sorting algorithm, and for what size data sets and stuff. But that's often extrinsic, and there's relatively less work about inside the system, how can I trade these things off? Not completely true. Microprocessors are constantly doing all kinds of stuff to figure out how to occupy their cache and stuff. But it's, I think, relatively speaking, this is something that could be useful and hasn't been thought about for some applications a whole lot.
Do you think that's one of the most lacking things in AI? Do you have something that you think is glaringly obvious that AI should be using more of in neuroscience or psychology? I know it goes the other way pretty easily.
So, like I said, I'm not sure that I have great ideas how to tell professionals in another field what they should be doing.
Yeah.
I mean, if I had to place a bet on AI, I would probably place the bet that the deep network pendulum is going to swing again back towards systems people understand, and that it's time to start thinking about the people who know how to sort of prove theorems again. Their time will be coming rapidly.
It seems to be rapid. Yeah, it seems to. There's a lot of pushback on deep nets these days, it seems.
I mean, they're incredibly useful. Obviously they've made huge, amazing progress, sort of consumer-facing technology, very rapidly solving all kinds of problems, that hadn't been solved before. But I'm just, my guess is that the low-hanging fruit will be eaten there, and the people who the other approaches will start catching up and showing their worth again. We'll see.
We're starting to get into some of these more general questions, but before we completely move off, what's the current state of, are you still working on this tract of the expected value of backup and moving forward, or what's the current state right now?
Yeah, well, so the awkwardness about that, of course, is that I don't have a rat lab, right? And rat experiments are, much slower than human experiments, and so we're trying to sort of develop the collaborations and influence people to figure out what's the best way to really test these ideas. And I think this paper has been well received, and I think that people are interested in. We worked hard to try to whittle it down to something that people could really understand and try to test, and that was a tough I'm not sure we succeeded, but we worked hard on that anyway. And so I think there's work to be done that we're trying to sort of plan really on rodent spatial experiments that have more of a learning. I mean, historically, on the one hand, this paper managed to explain a lot of stuff that was in literature, but those experiments weren't really the right experiments for testing this theory, right? They're not really kind of learning decision-making kind of experiments. They're just sort of incidentally, animals randomly foraging or something.
Right.
And so we really want to sort of put the two strands together, have animals do interesting learning problems and try to make predictions. So that's going on, but that's slow. There's sort of very limited things we can do with human neuroimaging on this as well. And we're working on that. So we can't see place cells in the hippocampus, but we can see faces in houses. And if we sort of paint locations with faces in houses, we might be able to sort of broadly see people thinking about different parts of the world in different times. We've had some success with that, but it's not the same kind of fine-grained measurements.
But the general gist is that it's time in the cycle of theory and experiment and modeling, it's time for the experiments to more closely address the model. Am I reading you right?
I think so. I mean, there's always more theory to be done as well. And we've talked about some of the ways in which the theory is, such as having a more realistic model of the meta control and how that would actually work in the brain and stuff. There are certainly things to be done. I also think that there are applications. I mentioned psychiatry and drug abuse and stuff a few times. There's been a lot of success, even given the limitations we talked about an hour ago, thinking about drug abuse and other compulsive disorders in terms of this kind of goal habits trade-off. That way of thinking not only has been sort of conceptually useful, I think, for people, it really is empirically the case that it seems like there is a dimension of compulsive disorders that really does seem to be transdiagnostically, obsessive compulsive disorder and drug abuse and compulsive gambling and eating disorders. There's something about those disorders that is really related to imbalance in these kinds of processes of model-based versus model-free or meta decision-making. But I think that this way of thinking things less about whether to think or not to think and more about what to think about is really going to give us a kind of finer window, not just on the problem of why am I digging around for cupcakes and garbage bags, but, hallucinations and rumination and other things that are really about kind of mismanagement of your potentially about or craving more positive phenomena, right? As opposed to just sort of neglect phenomena where I did something stupid because I didn't think about it, right? So I think there are interesting ideas there.
Well, I'm looking forward to talking to Yael about the computational psychiatry side of these things too. So that'll be interesting. What's the most critical open question that's intriguing you right now?
I mean, I think the biggest question at some level, I think it's the question of CCN. Where does behavior come from, right? Like, what produces behavior? And that obviously is a big question, but I think a lot of the interesting questions in neuroscience are about that. And a lot of the sort of less interesting work in neuroscience, in my opinion, is the work that sort of neglects behavior or doesn't treat it as the sort of focus. And one of the things that's great about CCN, I think, is that it's a behavior conference, I think.
I have let's see, what do I have in my pocket? Only some change. But I'm willing to bet that I know the answer to your answer to this next question. Let's say the question of figuring out behavior, right? That is intriguing to you right now. What do you think we need more of to figure this out? Do you think we need more theory? Do you think we need more technology, more data, more models? If you had to choose one,
I think theory is important. I mean, I don't think theory is an end in itself exactly, and I think it's all about the interplay between theory helping us understand experiments and experiments helping us refine theories and so on. But and I've been very interested in my own work and trying to really think hard about using theories and testing theories in the laboratory. But I'm very pro theory, of course. That's, I suppose, what you were.
These are the quarters I'll be maintaining in my pocket and using in a parking meter later. Yeah. I won the bet. So, I mean, and this is really related, but is theory the way that you approach, the lens through which you approach all problems? So we can talk about for instance, David Marr's levels, like the computational level and the algorithmic level and the implementation level. But, do you approach it through like this sort of computational theory-driven level, or through an evolutionary lens, or through an ethological lens? Like, do you always approach problems the same way, and through what lens?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a pretty unashamed Marr computational level Marr fan, right? Like I really do think that a lot of the insight, and this isn't incompatible with an evolutionary approach or whatever, obviously, or ethological, but there's so much insight in really specifying what the organism's objective function is, or something. What's the problem the organism is trying to solve? Like, one of the things I've learned from reinforcement, if reinforcement learning is one thing, it's like the Bellman equation. It's like a very careful quantification of what it is that you're trying to do when you solve a decision problem that involves multiple steps, right? What does it mean? Mm-hmm. Everything follows from that. Like, you write that down carefully enough, and all the algorithms are just like different ways of evaluating the Bellman equation, for decades, right? And it's so beautiful. And there are all these algorithms for doing that. And I think that's the interplay between the sort of computational, goal and the algorithms that instantiate or approximate that goal is sort of how I approach everything, I guess. I was sort of a one-trick pony in that respect.
So let's get a little time machine. Let's move forward 100 years. And we're thinking about our current era right now in neuroscience and AI. What will we have to think or write about it? How will people 100 years from now view this era in neuroscience and AI?
Well, I hope that they view it as extremely primitive and they understand a lot more. Maybe they'll have the 60,000 page version of Kandel and Swartz, and they'll long for a simpler time.
No, by then there'll be more pages than atoms in the universe.
Yeah, exactly. And this is why. I mean, actually, by the way, I tried to make that plot recently, and it slowed down. Like,
like
they
Moore's Law.
haven't been able to keep up with their own. Yeah, exactly. I think it's hard to predict. I hope that we have. I mean, we just know so little, especially in neuroscience, about how the brain works, right? Mm-hmm. I think the reason that we know a lot about computer science. I don't feel like the sort of principles of computation and AI are really. I feel like that's nice refinement, and I don't think there's huge revolutions that are going to happen. I think it's the crank keeps turning.
So do you think there's going to be a fundamental shift in the way we think about brains and another sort of revolution in neuroscience that's going to we're going to look back on this and kind of be embarrassed?
I mean, I think there sort of has. I mean, I'm embarrassed now.
I am too. Yeah.
We don't know anything. I mean, it's so hopeless. Like, it's just so complicated. It's such a mess. The reason that I'm so happy talking at the computer science level is that imposes some order on what it would otherwise just be, just a mess.
Yeah.
I think we're going to get better. We have to get better at understanding it. And I think, understanding computation in the abstract is part of that, but I think we will get better at understanding the mechanism too. And at the moment, I think we don't really have a hope currently, but that's going to hopefully change.
You have a hope that it's going to change. Well, if I knocked your chair out the window and you fell into a bath of liquid nitrogen or something, and I cryogenically froze you, but on the way down in your fall, you got to tell me how long you wanted to be frozen. What number? How long would you want to be frozen?
I actually do think that kind of 100, 200 year kind of time frame seems like the right, at least for this purpose of revisiting where neuroscience is. That I think that's about the right time to come back. I mean, so much has happened so fast, but still.
What about going back to the beginning of your own career? If you were going to start over, how would you proceed differently? Or a similar question is, how would you advise people maybe of your same sort of mindset to begin their careers, even if they're, pretty early still in the career?
Yeah, no, I think that's obviously a great question. The thing that I'm struggling with, and Tim is as well, a lot of us, is whether we need rat labs, right, or rodent labs.
You need monkey labs. If you want to really slow your career down, get a monkey lab.
Yeah, well, that's the either way, right? It's slow going, and I think it's no accident, and it's hard work, and it requires a lot of expertise, attention, and thought, and it's
I don't recommend it.
Yeah, but on the other hand, like there was this moment in time that Tim and I and Yael were all part of, and a bunch of us, where human fMRI is something. It's a shared facility. You could do experiments and do theory, and mostly do theory and make a lot of progress. And so there were just a whole bunch of us sort of made our careers that way, where we could sort of go back and forth between doing experiments that we could manage when we were sort of mostly full-time theorists. And I think that's, there's still stuff to do there. But like for me, these questions that I'm running up against in the project we talked about, right, and in another project we didn't talk about, they're single neuron questions. The time scale and the spatial scale is just not going to work with human neuroimaging. So we're sort of back. Are we going to bite the bullet and really invest in doing more detailed experiments, right? And maybe we're all at the point in our careers we can do that now, or maybe it's too late. I'm not sure, but I think Tim is also thinking about this. I think, just for instance,
that's going to slow it down, man. It's going to really slow it down.
It is, it is that, and that, on the other hand, if that's, I am sold on the exciting technologies and the things that are becoming possible, and partly because of the division of kind of labor and specialization, the people who are coming up with those technologies aren't coming up with the behaviors and the, computational models and stuff. There really is, and maybe the other way to say this, apart from my own, outside of my own sort of angst about my own career or the direction of what I'm going to work on, there's real opportunities there, right? For people who know the stuff that, my generation of people knows, to take this into that world and run with it, right? I mean, there's really exciting stuff to be done there. Mm-hmm. It's not easy, and maybe it's not possible for someone to know enough about viruses and electrodes and stuff at the same time they know about this, and that just won't work. But it seems like there's real opportunities there and questions that we're all facing.
What advice would you give to my nephew or something like, or niece or something, like that's thinking about getting into this whole world, neuroscience, AI, cognition, etc.?
No, part of it obviously is, learn the math and the computer science and the modeling. But I do think if they were, when I think about can I advise my grad students to go, where are they going to make a difference and have a comparative advantage and do new things? I think it's coming into contact with areas that haven't quite, and one of them is kind of rodent behavioral, fancy optogenetic neuroscience, right? And others are psychiatry. And, I think, from where I'm sitting, the things that we're doing and know are worth knowing. And there are lots of opportunities to take that, to a field to conquer new areas and develop new synergies.
If you had a magic wand and you could just wave it and become an expert in any topic that would help you forge ahead, what would that be?
I mean, right now in the short term, I think it really would be like rodent physiology. Okay. I know you think I'm crazy here, and I have, but there's just so many questions. Like if I could just conjure up a rat lab, and
that would be so that's worth doing, because it just takes so many resources and it's such a drag to do that's worth waving a magic wand about.
Wave a wand, exactly. Yeah. But you notice I haven't actually done it, because it really is.
There's no wand. Yeah. So you have an interesting situation in that both you and your wife, Yael Niv, are experts in this domain. When you guys get together for holidays with family, what is it like trying to describe what you do to family and, or friends who aren't in this field?
I mean, people are very polite, right? And, it's we can have polite conversations, but it's hard to.
What's like the most difficult thing to communicate, to have it land?
I mean, I think not just with, civilians, but with other neuroscientists.
Yeah.
I feel like the perspective, the sort of Marian perspective that at least what I really care about, what really matters, and what the way to really understand things is this abstract level. The sort of what's the point of the endeavor? What's a result? When should we be satisfied? I think, when you talk to regular people, they have they have a view, which I also had, and lots of people have, that we're just going to sort of take apart the clock and like figure out how the little pieces interact with all the other little pieces, and we're going to figure out how the brain works, and then that will help us build better computers or something. And there's obviously a huge amount of, maybe the majority of neuroscience, that's still kind of pursuing that. And my pessimism is that that's just hopeless, right? That there are organisms we know the whole connectome have for decades, and don't understand a thing about how they work, really. But so thinking about things in a different way, and the goal is not this sort of physical mimicry, or at least in the short term, is a tough thing to communicate, both professionally and personally, as it were.
What's something that you used to believe that you consider naive now?
Well, that's an example, right? Like, actually, the first time when I first was deciding where to go to grad school, actually, I entered the field in 96, 97, right? And so I came of age with the publication of this famous paper on the temporal difference model, prediction error model of dopamine neurons, right?
Yeah.
And I was actually thinking about going to work with Peter Dayan, who I did end up working with for my postdoc during my PhD. And I was reading this paper, and it just struck me as like ridiculously abstract and obtuse, and like removed from the real, biology, basically. I probably have a version. I probably threw it out, but somewhere I probably have a version that was sort of marked up with my naive comments,
derisive comments.
Yeah, exactly. And it's turned out my whole career is based not just on this approach, but this paper, right?
Yeah.
But it really does. You look at that paper without an appreciation for it, and it just looks like. And I encounter this when I give talks. Like, what are you talking about? What does this have to do with the brain, right? Like, it's just a bunch of symbols. So it took me time to really to develop the conviction that actually is the right way to think about things, or a useful way of thinking about things.
You grew up in Boulder, right? Colorado.
I did. Yeah.
So I'm in Durango. What do I need to do in Boulder? Best place to eat in Boulder?
Oh, I like the kitchen, actually.
Oh, the kitchen. I've heard of that place. Yeah.
It's pretty good.
So did you grow up people who live in Boulder really look down on people who don't mountain climb and do like all sorts of, at least like 4 or 5 different outdoor activities, sort of semi-professionally? Was that the case?
No, I was never culturally all that. I moved to New York and tried to pretend like that I'd always lived in New York, and I was sort of more of a Woody Allen. And in Boulder, I was never, a rock climber, as it were. But
I see. Well, Nathaniel, thank you so much. You spent so much time talking to me. I really appreciate it. You can find Nathaniel on Twitter at Nathaniel Daw, and of course, I'll link to the paper and some backup the paper we talked about, and then some that sort of lead up to that paper as well. I now release you to go continue your childcare and eat a hamburger, for God's sakes.
That sounds great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Cool. Thanks a lot.
Brain Inspired is a production of me and you. You can support the show through Patreon for a microscopic $2 or $4 per month. Go to braininspired.co and find the red Patreon button there. Your contribution will help sustain and improve the show and prohibit any annoying advertisements like you hear on other shows. To get in touch with me, email paul@braininspired.co. The music you hear is by The New Year. Find them at thenewyear.net. Thanks for your support. See you next time.